So we're going to get started. And as we start, I want to begin by just highlighting a few of the kind of fundamentals that are really important to keep forefront in your mind. They often get overlooked. So when you're talking about college financial aid, what really matters is gift aid, grants, and scholarships. And it's easy and often the case that people tend to think about loans, but you always want to focus on gift aid first. Another important thing to keep in mind is that almost all gift aid comes directly from colleges. So there's a myth out there that there's all kinds of unclaimed scholarships waiting for people to identify them and claim them. That really isn't the case. 90% or more of gift aid comes directly from colleges. So your best chance to get gift aid is to identify colleges that might award it to your student. Another important thing to keep in mind is that the price of college is the net price. The true cost of college is the net price. And we'll be talking about that a lot. It's very easy sometimes to get kind of confused about what is the true cost that you should be focusing on. The amount of gift aid that your student is going to get depends on your student's profile. By that I mean how much gift aid your student might possibly be eligible for and how much your student might get in academic scholarships. That's part of the puzzle, but the other part is how colleges award their aid. So some colleges have very strong need-based aid programs, and if you have high need, those are good colleges to try to apply to. Other colleges offer more aid on the basis of academics and scholarships. And so depending on your student's profile, you may want to target particular types of colleges that may be good candidates to award aid. And we'll be talking about how to do that tonight. A really important point is that unless your student applies to affordable colleges in the fall, having affordable choices from which to choose in the spring is a matter of luck. So if your student is a junior, you're listening to this at the perfect time. You want to be starting to think about those cost considerations and including colleges that are likely to be affordable so that when your student applies to colleges in the fall, he or she will be applying to some, at least, that will be affordable. And when we talk about affordability, affordability is different for everyone. It's based on the student's net price and the resources you have available to pay the net price. So those are the fundamentals. Let's talk about the agenda. Basically two main parts. One of them is assessing where you might get aid. And when I say you, I really mean the student, even though paying for college is a family affair. The other big part is deciding what you can afford. Assessing where you might get aid is a question of identifying the student's profile in terms of eligibility for need and merit-based aid, and then also identifying colleges whose aid awarding policies are likely to result in them offering aid to your student. Deciding what you can afford is a question of making sure you understand the true total cost, the net price of the degree, understanding the resources that you have available to pay for college. And that's really savings plus the amount that you can pay out of income. You also have to understand if you're going to have to borrow to pay for college. And if you do, you want to make sure that the amount of money that you borrow is going to be reasonable. So when people talk about the cost of college, they tend to focus on what I call the sticker price or the starting price. So at USM, or University of Maine, that's 23, 25,000. At University of New England in Biddeford, it's about 56,000. And at Bowdoin, it's over 70,000. But it turns out that colleges award a significant amount of aid that helps to reduce the cost. And in fact, the average amount of gift aid at USM and University of Maine is close to 7,000 to 10,000. It's about 22,000 at UNE and 47,000 at Bowdoin. So when you take those into account, it turns out that the net price for students who receive financial aid ranges from 12,000 at USM to 34,000 at University of New England. However, not everyone receives gift aid. And when you look at the percent of students who receive aid, most students, in fact, almost all students, receive gift aid at University of Maine or UNE, but at Bowdoin, only about half of the students receive gift aid. What that means is that about half the students at Bowdoin are paying that full starting cost of 71,000 or so, and half of them are paying something less. So when you take into account the average of all students, not just those who receive aid, the true net price ranges from about 12,000 at USM, 18,000 at Orono, 34,000 at UNE, and 47,000 at Bowdoin. So the reason that I'm going through all of this detail is to really remind you that what's important is not what colleges cost, and definitely not what you're going to see in clickbait on the internet about these are the best value colleges. What really matters is what you're going to pay. What you're going to pay is your net price. That's the college's cost of attendance minus the gift aid that the college awards to your student. So let's talk about the types of financial aid. There are two broad categories. One of them is gift aid. That's free money, money that the colleges give to you and you don't have to pay back. And this actually reduces the cost of college. Now, if the gift aid is awarded on the basis of need, it's usually called a grant. If it's awarded based on the student's academics, it's called merit aid or scholarships. The other category of financial aid is self-help. And this doesn't reduce the cost of college, but it helps to manage the cost. Self-help includes work study, the job that the student gets at college to help pay some of the costs, or loans, money that's borrowed to pay the cost of college, but then has to be repaid after college with interest. So when you hear these terms, it's pretty clear that gift aid is better than self-help, and everyone would rather have gift aid. However, colleges don't really make it easy to distinguish all the time between gift aid and other types of aid. So what I'm showing you now is an example of a college financial aid award letter. That's the way that colleges notify students of how much aid they're going to receive. And if you look at this award letter, it looks like there's $22,000 worth of aid, which is great. However, out of the 7 line items on the award letter, 4 of them are gift aid, 2 of them are loans, and 1 of them is work study. So you always want to distinguish between the categories of aid on an award letter. And when you break it down, it turns out that the gift aid is about $15,000, the loans are $5,500, and the work study is $1,800. Now, $15,000 of gift aid is still a lot of money, but it's not nearly as good as $22,000. And there's some important information that's missing. So what's missing? The starting cost of that list price and the net price, the true cost after subtracting gift aid from the starting cost. Well, I went online to this college and I looked that information up. And it turned out that the total starting cost, the list price, was just under $50,000. The amount of gift aid that we identified was about $15,000, and so the net price was $34,865. Now, keep that number in mind because we're going to come back to it at the end of the session. But for now, let's talk a little bit more about aid, and let's focus on gift aid. So need-based aid is typically called grants. It's determined by the family's income and assets. People apply for gift aid using the FAFSA. The FAFSA is required for loans and gift aid at all U.S. colleges. In addition to the FAFSA, about 150 colleges require an additional financial aid application called the CSS Profile. Now, there are over 2,000 four-year colleges in the US, and out of those, only about 150 require the profile, but they tend to be the most generous and often the best known colleges. So as you go through the financial aid process, there's a good chance that you will encounter both the FAFSA and the CSS Profile. We'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute. The other type of gift aid is merit aid or scholarships. And this is typically based on things like grades, test scores, class rank, and so on. This is often awarded automatically when the student is admitted to a college. But in some cases, there are supplemental applications required. So you always want to spend some time on the financial aid pages of the websites of the colleges your student applies to so that you understand how to apply for as much financial aid as possible. All right, so let's talk about need-based aid first, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit more about scholarships. So need-based aid is typically called grants, and this is the algebra portion of the ED. Need equals COA minus EFC. Need is a specific term in the financial aid world. And what it means is the potential eligibility for need-based aid. It doesn't mean how much the student is going to receive. It's the maximum amount of need-based aid a student might receive at a given college. So let's break down those initials a little bit. COA stands for cost of attendance, and that's always made up of 4 elements. They are tuition and fees, room and board, books and supplies, and then transportation and other miscellaneous expenses. EFC stands for expected family contribution, and this is one of the most misleading terms in the English language. Because if you read it in English, it looks like this is what you're going to pay for college. However, most people don't pay their EFC. They may pay more, they may pay less, but hardly anyone pays their actual EFC as the price they pay for college. All the EFC really is a way of ranking all of the students who apply to college in a given year in terms of their family's economic resources. So with more resources tend to have a higher EFC. People with fewer resources tend to have a lower EFC. The lower the EFC, the greater the potential eligibility for need-based aid. Not necessarily how much you'll get, but how much you might get. So we've been talking about how much you might get. How much you will get depends on how colleges award their financial aid. Some colleges have very generous need-based aid programs, and they will claim to meet full need based on the FAFSA or the profile. Other colleges meet less need, or in some cases, even none of them with gift aid. If you are interested in estimating your EFC, you can go to this website. Don't forget, I'll put my email address up at the end, and if anyone would like the slides, I'll be happy to send them to you. And if you go to this website and estimate your EFC, that's helpful information, but it's not sufficient. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say you go to that website and you estimate your EFC and it turns out to be 30,000. What that means is you will qualify for 0 need-based aid at the University of Maine because your EFC at 30,000 is greater than the University of Maine's starting cost at 25,000 or so. On the other hand, at Bowdoin, where the starting cost is 72,000, you could be potentially eligible for as much as 42,000 in need-based aid. So that's why knowing your EFC can be helpful as you're going through the college financial aid process. Another thing to keep in mind is that each college defines its own idea of need. So your need at one college might be different than that at another college. And it rarely turns out to be the case that your idea of need is the same as the college's. So we said that EFC determines need aid eligibility. Lower EFC means greater eligibility for need-based aid. There are 2 EFC formulas, one based on the FAFSA and one based on the CSS profile, but they both have the same basic approach, which is to look at the income and the assets of the parents and the student. So there are actually 4 separate calculations going on in the background. All of those 4 calculations are then added up, and the total becomes the EFC. Now, it turns out that a lot of people think that their assets are really going to be hurting their ability to qualify for financial aid. And in some cases, that's the case. But for most people, income plays a much bigger role in determining the EFC than assets do. Once you reach the maximum amount of income that's going to be assessed, or the minimum amount of income, that's going to be assessed, every dollar above that adds about 47 cents to the EFC. Once you reach the threshold for assets, every dollar of assets above that adds about a nickel to the EFC. So as you can see, income in general plays a much bigger role in the EFC than assets do. Another thing to keep in mind is that student assets tend to contribute more than parent assets. So if you happen to have assets in the student's name, they could have a bigger impact on the EFC than parent assets do. This might be the case, for example, if a grandparent might have given the student money a long time ago, and that has grown into a savings account. So 10,000 in the student's name can add 2,000 to 2,500 to the EFC. If it were in the parent's name, it would add only about 500 to the EFC. Now, there is a special loophole that, unlike most loopholes, is available to just about everyone. And that is that if you have assets in the student's name, you can put those into a student-owned 529 account. And there is special treatment of student-owned 529 accounts. They are considered as parent asset. So instead of being assessed at the student rate of 20 to 25%, they're assessed at the parent rate of about 5 to 5.64% maximum in determining the EFC. So there are a few special cases in determining the EFC that I want to highlight for you. One of them is that if there are multiple siblings in college at the same time, the parent portion of the EFC is shared among the siblings. However, there's a great big asterisk next to this, because a law passed this past December is going to be changing this for the academic year that begins in the fall of 2023. Beginning in the fall of 2023, that multiple sibling discount is going to be going away. So that is something that used to be quite a benefit to people who happen to have more than one child in college at the same time. That is likely not to be the case in the future. Another special case that I want to highlight, and I'm going to go over this in a little bit more detail in a couple of minutes, is the fact that when the FAFSA and the CSS profile ask about income, they are looking at income that was earned in the past. And so if your circumstances have changed, you want to be sure to get in touch with the college and let them know that your circumstances have changed. Now, the good news is if your circumstances have changed for the better, in other words, that might raise your EFC, you don't have to notify them. But if your circumstances have changed for the worse, if you've lost a job, for example, or have had high medical expenses after the year that's being considered, then you want to notify the college and ask them if it's possible to make an adjustment in your eligibility for need-based aid. The college has the ability to make that judgment, but they aren't required to. So it's always going to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis, and the college may or may not allow it, but it's always in your interest to ask the question anyway. The final special case that I want to talk about is when the parents are divorced or separated. And in this case, the FAFSA treatment is very different from the profile treatment. So let's talk about the FAFSA first. The FAFSA looks at the custodial parent only, and if that parent has remarried, they look at the new spouse. Now, the custodial parent for financial aid purposes is not necessarily the same as it might be on a legal decree. The custodial parent for financial aid purposes now is the parent with whom the student lives more than 50% of the time. Another change due to that law that was passed in December is that beginning in 2023, the custodial parent will be considered the parent who contributed the greater amount toward the student's support. So that's going to be changing. But the basic fact that the FAFSA looks at only one of the two biological parents in the case of divorce will be continuing. And of course, if that parent has remarried, they will look at the new spouse. The profile almost always looks at the income and assets of both biological parents. And if those parents have remarried, they will look at the income and assets of the new spouses. So the profile may be looking at the income and assets of as many as 4 different people in determining eligibility for need-based aid. Now, the profile does do some calculations that are intended to put the primary burden for paying for college on the biological parents, but those calculations are imperfect, and so it can turn out to be disadvantageous if biological parents remarry in terms of financial aid. All right, so what we've talked about so far is the EFC, and that's really defining the student's eligibility for need-based aid. We said at the beginning that it's also important to understand how colleges award aid. So if your student has financial need, then you want to try to identify colleges that might meet that need. So how do you do that? One of the ways you can do it is going to this website that the College Board maintains. And this has all kinds of data about how colleges award financial aid. So if you look at the University of Maine meets about 73% of need on average. However, out of the need that they meet, about 54% of it is met with gift aid and 46% of it is met with self-help. loans or work study. When you multiply 73% of need met times 54% of need met with gift aid, it means that on average at the University of Maine, 39% of need is met with gift aid. Now, the University of Maine is almost always an affordable choice for Maine residents, but that's because the starting cost is lower, not because they have an especially generous need-based aid program. When you look at other colleges, it turns out that NYU, New York University, meets about 71% of need, and 77% of that is met with gift aid. So on average, about 55% of need is met with gift aid. At BU, they're a little better. They meet 93% of need, and of that, they meet about 80% with gift aid. So 93% times 80% means on average about 74% of need at BU is met with gift aid. And at Colby, which is kind of the gold standard of a college meeting full financial need, they meet 100% of need as defined by the profile, which is the same as the CSS profile. I use those terms interchangeably. And of that, they need about 92% of it with gift aid. So if you have high financial need, a college like Colby is likely to meet a very substantial portion of that with gift aid. BU is going to meet less. NYU will meet even less with gift aid on average, and so on. So these are averages. They tell you, they suggest to you colleges where you might look. Clearly, it's going to be better to apply to Colby and get need-based aid than it would to NYU. But they don't necessarily tell you exactly how much you're going to get. And we'll talk about how to estimate that a little bit later. I want to talk about the dates and the timing for the CSS profile and the FAFSA. So what I want to show you is an example of a current high school junior. So a student who's going to graduate from high school in the spring of 2022. For financial need purposes, the FAFSA and the profile are going to be asking about income that was earned in calendar year 2020. So the year that just ended a few months ago. You're probably thinking about taxes. Maybe you filed your taxes in a typical year. It would be April 15th. This year, it's been extended into May. Your student is going to be applying to college in the fall of this year. And at the same time that your student is applying to college, you'll be wanting to fill out the financial aid forms, the FAFSA, and if it's required, the CSS profile. That will allow colleges, when they notify the student of whether they've been accepted, to also, on a pretty timely basis, notify them of how much financial aid they will be getting. So the income that's looked at for the FAFSA and the profile is income that was earned 2 years in the past, 2 years prior to the year the student is entering college. The assets are valued as of the date that you file the financial aid forms. So as of the date that you click submit on the CSS profile or the FAFSA. And that potentially can give you a little bit of opportunity for lowering your EFC. Now remember, I said that income typically counts more heavily than assets do in determining the EFC, but assets do play a role. So if you can reduce the impact of assets, you might get a little bit more aid. So if, for example, you know that you have an expense that you need to incur in the fall of 2021, you might want to file the FAFSA in the profile after you've incurred that expense. Now, you don't want to go out and spend money foolishly, but for example, if you pay estimated taxes, if you're self-employed, you might be better off to pay your estimated taxes a little early before filing the FAFSA and the CSS profile. So that's kind of a little tip in terms of planning. This is a table that summarizes the dates that will apply in terms of income and assets for high school juniors, so students who are in the class of 2022. You need to file the financial aid forms each year. So the first year of college, they're going to be looking at 2020 income. The second year, they'll be looking at 2021, the third year, 2022, and the fourth year, 2023. So that turns out that 2023, the final income year considered for the FAFSA in the profile, is the year that ends when your student is a sophomore in college. Here's another potential planning tip. It turns out that if someone other than the parents helps to pay for college, so for example, in a family where the student is fortunate enough to have a grandparent helping with college expenses, those grandparent payments are considered as income to the student in the year in which they are received. Currently, they're considered income for both the FAFSA and the profile. Another change that the FAFSA will be making in 2023 is that those will no longer be considered for the FAFSA. But I expect that colleges that use the CSS profile will continue to count that as income. So if the grandparent makes payments before December 31st of the student's sophomore year of college, those could have a negative impact. They could reduce eligibility for need-based financial aid. If the grandparent waits until after January 1st of the student's sophomore year of college to make those payments, then the final income year that's considered for the CSS profile will have passed. And so it will no longer have negative impact on the potential eligibility for need-based aid. So if that's the case in your family, that might be something to consider. If your student doesn't get need-based aid, don't worry about those grandparent payments. If it's merit-based or if you're paying the full sticker price, for example, at University of Maine, then don't worry about any grandparent payments because need-based aid is not part of the picture in that case. I'm going to include these tables for sophomores and ninth graders. So if you email me and request the slides, you can have these for your references. So I've been talking about some pretty significant changes to the FAFSA that are going to be coming. And as I mentioned, those are going to be effective for the academic year 2023 to 2024. So if your student is a high school junior in the class of 2022, your student is going to be subject to the old FAFSA rules for the first year of college, and then the new FAFSA rules for the final 3 years of college. So those changes are that most income items are going to be coming directly from the IRS. So it will be quite streamlined and generally pretty easy to import tax data directly from the IRS into the FAFSA. That will make it more streamlined and easier for most people. And they're also changing that term, which I dislike so much, the expected family contribution. That's going to become the Student Aid Index, or SAI. However, in terms of eligibility for need-based aid, it's still going to be the same formula. Cost minus EFC is going to be the same as cost minus SAI in determining eligibility for aid. In addition, right now, the FAFSA does not count the value of a small business or a family farm, and small businesses are defined as those with fewer than 100 employees. That is likely to change. It's apparently going to change with this new law for academic year 2023. If the parents are divorced, the custodial parent is going to be the parent who completed more than half of the student's expenses, or a greater share of the student's expenses. College payments by relatives will no longer be counted as student income for the FAFSA. I think that that's going to be different for the profile. And that discount for multiple siblings in college simultaneously will be eliminated. So the impact of these FAFSA changes is that very needy students are going to benefit. It's likely to make them eligible for more aid or not have a serious negative impact on them. For middle income and middle class families, it probably is less beneficial. The crucial question is going to be what happens to the CSS profile. So is the CSS profile going to conform to these new FAFSA rules? The reason that's important is because the most generous need-based aid comes from profile colleges. And at those very generous colleges, the maximum annual aid based on the FAFSA is about $7,000 to $10,000 per year. The maximum aid based on the profile could potentially be as much as $70,000 a year. So you can see that the profile plays a much bigger role in reducing cost at some of these very expensive colleges. Colleges that don't use the profile, that use the FAFSA only, often gap, which means that there's a gap between the amount of need that the student has and the amount of aid that the college offers. Those FAFSA changes may not make as much impact on those colleges because they don't meet need fully anyway. So my educated guess is that of those major changes, the profile will conform to the FAFSA in determining which parent is the custodial parent. That really doesn't make that much difference because the profile tends to look at the income and assets of both biological parents anyway. In terms of the FAFSA no longer counting support from relatives as untaxed income to the student, I am very doubtful that the profile will conform. I think that the profile will continue to include that as income. And whether the profile colleges will continue to provide a discount for multiple siblings in the college at the same time, that's an open question. These colleges do tend to be more generous, and so I think there's a good chance that they may continue to offer that discount, but we're probably not going to know for some time. Profile colleges have not made any announcements as to what they're going to do in terms of these changes. So the bottom line for you in terms of my advice is don't make changes based on these expected FAFSA changes simply for financial aid purposes. Be sure that any changes that you make sense for your overall financial plan. And that's in general a good rule of thumb anyway. You should always make sure that any potential changes that you're thinking about in order to potentially qualify for more financial aid make sense in terms of your overall financial planning. So a really important question in thinking about need-based aid is, will need-based aid make college affordable? Another way of asking this is, can you afford your EFC? And to answer this question, I want to show you an example of how a very generous full need college awards need-based aid. So in this example, the college's starting cost is $72,000 and the EFC is $30,000. When you subtract $30,000 EFC from a $72,000 cost, you have $42,000 of need. So how does the college meet that need? Well, it turns out that they meet the first $4,500 out of the $42,000 with a loan. They meet the next $2,200 with work study. Only after loans and work study have been awarded does the college start to award gift aid. And they award gift aid equal to the difference between the total need of $42,000 and the loans and work study that had already been awarded. In this case, that turns out to be about $35,000. When you subtract the $35,000 in gift aid from the $72,000 starting cost, that means that the net price for this student for the first year of college is about $37,000. In year two, it's a similar picture, except that the college awards a little bit more in loans. Instead of $4,500, they award $5,500. So the net price goes up by about $1,000. In years 3 and 4, it's a similar pattern. The net price continues to creep up a little bit. And at the end of 4 years, there was an EFC of $120,000. There was financial need of $168,000. The college met $168,000 in need, but out of that, only $135,000 was gift aid. So the total net price for 4 years at this college is about $153,000, or $33,000 more than the EFC. And remember, this is a very generous college, and this example doesn't include inflation. So if you're trying to decide if need-based aid will make college affordable, or in other words, if you're trying to decide if you can afford the EFC, here's a rule of thumb. If the EFC times 4 plus about $40,000 is not affordable, then need-based aid is probably not going to be the answer to your paying for college problem. All right, so we've talked about how the student is eligible for need-based aid. That's the EFC calculation. We've talked about how colleges award need-based aid. That's the other piece of that puzzle. Let's turn to merit-based aid. And to talk about merit-based aid, we really need to start by talking a little bit about the business of college, because in many important respects, college is a business. So when students and families think about colleges, they tend to focus on the acceptance rate. That's the percent of students who applied to a college who were offered admission to the college. At Harvard, that's about 5%. At Northeastern and BU, it's around 20%. At Ohio Wesleyan in Ohio, it's 67%. In Susquehanna in Pennsylvania, it's 85%. Well, colleges, of course, pay attention to the acceptance rate, but they also focus on a different number, which is the yield rate. The yield rate is the percent of students who were offered admission at a college and who end up enrolling at that college in the fall. So at Harvard, 4 out of 5 students who are offered admission to Harvard end up going to Harvard. At Northeastern and BU, it's about a quarter. And at Ohio Wesleyan and Susquehanna, it's 15% or less. Now, when that yield rate gets into the 20s and lower, colleges really start to worry about whether they're going to have enough students to pay enough tuition to pay the bills. So what do? They discount their prices with financial aid in order to compete for yield. It's like a business having a sale. If they can't sell it at this price, maybe they can sell it at 20% less than that price. So this third column shows the percent of students at a college who receive college-funded gift aid. Now, this gift aid could be need-based aid or it could be merit-based aid. And I'm going to tell you how to think about the portion that's merit. So when a college has a relatively high acceptance rate and a relatively low yield rate and a relatively high percent of students receiving college-funded gift aid, then there is a strong possibility that that college uses merit aid as part of its strategy of how to award financial aid. So if need-based aid is not going to be the answer to your paying for college problem, perhaps identifying colleges that might award your student merit aid might be another way to get a discount on the price. So let's talk about merit aid in a little bit more detail. And as a reminder, that's typically called scholarships. It's based on things like GPA, class rank, test scores. And merit aid is most prevalent at private colleges, but more and more public colleges are using it too. Here's a key point. The highest awards go to the strongest students relative to the school's other applicants. So what that means is that if you're looking for merit aid, the highest merit offers may come at colleges that you might consider safety schools. So a safety school for admission might also be a safety school for financial aid. Once again, college aid policies vary, ranging from colleges that award no merit aid to colleges that award primarily on the basis of merit. So a lot of those CSS profile colleges that we talked about that are very generous in need-based aid use little or no merit aid. So at the Ivy Leagues, zero merit aid. At Bowdoin, Colby, and Bates, zero merit aid. So even if your student is a great student and can gain acceptance to one of those colleges, if you cannot pay that EFC, then that college may not be affordable. So let me show you some specific examples of colleges and the way they award merit aid. And I'm going to show you Gettysburg in Pennsylvania and then two Florida colleges, the University of Tampa and Eckerd. And on the screen, you can see the admit rate, the yield rate, and the cost of attendance for these colleges. And down at the bottom, that percent of students who receive college-funded gift aid. So at Gettysburg, their highest merit award is $32,000 a year. And that generally goes to students with a 1450 or higher SAT out of 1600 and a 3.8 GPA. At the University of Tampa, it's $15,000 and it goes to students with a 1380 SAT. At Eckerd College, it's $22,000 and it goes to students with a 1310 on the SAT. And then you can see that there are some lower merit awards, and those are associated with lower SAT and grade point averages. Well, what I want to do now is layer in the college's 75th and 25th percentile of SAT scores. The 75th percentile means that 25% of the students scored higher. So at Gettysburg, 25% of the students scored higher than 1410 on their SAT. And you can see that their highest merit award is a little bit above that 75th percentile. That pattern holds true at Tampa and Eckerd. And you can see that at the 25th percentile, that's pretty close to the lower end of those financial aid awards, so of the merit awards. So again, the 25th percentile means that 25% of the students at Gettysburg scored lower than 1280 on their SATs. It turns out that you can make a generalization from this, and that is that if a college uses merit aid, the best chances for large awards are when you're above the college's 75th percentile. If a college uses merit aid, the awards may phase out when you get to about the 25th percentile. But at colleges that compete aggressively for students, they may award merit aid to nearly everyone. So if you know what your student's profile is in terms of their grades, test scores, and so on, how can you identify colleges that might award merit aid? Well, this is a great resource maintained by the federal government. And this is where I get that percent of students receiving college-funded gift aid. So at Gettysburg, it's 87%. At Washington College in Maryland, it is 100%. So here's a rule of thumb. If that percent of students receiving college-funded gift aid is over 60 to 65%, there's a pretty good chance that that college uses merit aid part of its financial aid awarding strategy. If it's over 80%, it's highly, highly, highly likely that the college uses merit aid. So where might your student get merit aid? Well, one way to go is to look for SAT scores. US News and World Report maintains a database of this, and you can go to the library and look it up. So I want to show you an example of a student who has an 1150 combined SAT. And let's see if we can identify some colleges where this student might get some merit aid. It turns out that at Shenandoah University in Virginia, their 75th percentile is 1123. That's under the student's 1150. So this student is in the top 25th percentile at Shenandoah College and is likely to qualify for one of the stronger merit awards. You can also see that at Suffolk in Boston, at Old Dominion in Virginia, and UMass Dartmouth, this student is above the 75th percentile, and so may be a good candidate for some of the highest awards. Even if the student isn't above the 75th percentile, but is rather close, the student might not get the highest award, but the student might get some pretty nice merit aid offers. So at the University of Maine or Pace or Lesley in Boston, this student isn't quite above the 75th percentile, but is close. And so I would expect that this student might get a pretty good merit award at these colleges. Now, with COVID, a lot of students were not able to take the SATs last year, and many colleges have gone SAT optional. The advantage of SATs in this type of kind of rule of thumb work is that it's easy to compare across colleges. If your student hasn't taken them, or if your student might be applying test optional, you can still kind of ballpark this. If your student is a very strong student in terms of grades, maybe talk to the guidance counselor and see what a typical college might be that would where that student might be a target. Look at what that college's typical SAT scores are and use that as a benchmark for thinking about where your student might fall in that 75th percentile range. All right, so we've talked about need-based aid, we've talked about merit-based aid. I want to summarize it for you, and I'm dividing colleges into 4 major categories, which I call elite, near elite, mid-market, and other. It turns out that at those elite and near elite colleges, those colleges tend to rely primarily on need-based aid in the way that they award financial aid. They almost always use the CSS profile as their financial aid form, and they often meet nearly full need with gift aid. On the other hand, they use very little or no merit aid. So those are the colleges that are likely to be good candidates if a student has high need. Now, obviously, a student still needs to be admitted to those, but that's and that can be a problem. At the mid-market and other colleges, those colleges tend not to have a strong need-based aid programs. They often leave a gap between the student's financial need and the amount of aid that they offer. But they tend to use a significant amount of merit aid. Now, it turns out that there are about 80 to 100 colleges in that elite or near elite category. there are over 2,000 colleges in the mid-market and other categories. What that means is that there are a lot of colleges who are trying to recruit your student and might be good candidates to award your student merit aid. All right, so we've talked about how colleges award aid. Let's talk now about how you might get some estimates of your cost of college. And the way to do that is to use what's called net price calculator. The net price calculator is an online tool that's required by law. All colleges have to have them, and it's supposed to tell you a personalized cost of attendance, estimate of gift aid, and net price. Now, all colleges have to have a net price calculator, but they don't have to have a good one. And here's how you can tell. If a net price calculator is super easy to use, it takes about 10 minutes, you're in and done, it probably stinks. If a net price calculator asks a lot of questions, enough to really get into the nitty-gritty of how much need your student might have, what kind of grades your student has, and that kind of thing, then there's a good chance that it's going to give you a reliable estimate. This website is maintained by the government, and it leads to links to net price calculators at all colleges. It's not always up to date. If you can't find it there, you can go to the college's website and just do a search for net price calculator. And always remember, cost of attendance minus gift aid equals the net price. Now, when you use a net price calculator, you're sometimes going to find that the output may not be as user-friendly as you would like, particularly if you're not a numbers person. This is an example of the net price calculator output that I think can seem a little intimidating to people who are not numbers people. What you want to do is remember that the net price is the cost of attendance minus the gift aid. The cost of attendance is always made up of 4 elements: tuition and fees, room and board, books and supplies, transportation and other miscellaneous expenses. Identify the gift aid, do the arithmetic to subtract it, and you come up with your net price, which at this college is $34,436 for 1 year. When you use net price calculators, what you want to do is compare the net price side by side so that you can have an apples to apples comparison of what the costs are. And here's where I want to remind myself to step back a little bit, because we've been talking about money questions all evening long. And those, of course, are important, but it's not the only thing. And my goal is not necessarily to have everyone find the cheapest possible college. My goal is for people to find colleges that are going to be good fits for their students in terms of the academics they offer, in terms of the environment that they offer, but are also likely to be affordable. So that's the key thing. It's like any other consumer product that you might purchase. You compare the prices. You might like one better than another, but you think about what you can afford, and then you make a decision as to what is what's affordable and what you're going to buy. Unfortunately, in the college purchasing process, there are a lot of emotional factors that come into play. So sometimes things can get a little out of hand. So it is always good to make sure you keep in mind those affordability questions. All right, so once you compare the net price side by side, then you can compare the costs of those different colleges. So I'm showing you an example here of a student whose need profile is that they have an EFC of 15,000. The merit profile is that they have B- to B grades and an 1100 SAT. Well, at Roger Williams in Rhode Island, the cost of attendance is 58,000. The merit aid that they're likely to offer is 13. They're going to offer an additional $5,500 in need base above that. So the net price will be $40,000 for 1 year at Roger Williams. At Shenandoah, it's about $35,000. At Wheaton College in Massachusetts, it's $25,000. Orono is about $22,000. Bowdoin looks great. That's $17,000. That's only $2,000 more than the EFC. And at USM, living at home and commuting to college, the net price is about $10,000. Now, a couple of things I want to point out. I know that living at home with your parents and commuting to USM is not an apples to apples comparison to going away to college and living in the dorm. The reason that I put that on there is to remind people that there is an affordable path to college for everyone. It may not be the first thing that you thought about, but it's much more important to have a 4-year affordable college degree than to get out of college and be overburdened by a crippling amount of debt. Another thing to point out, at Bowdoin, a B- student probably is not going to get in. And so that gray color is identifying that as an unlikely candidate for admission. The light green means maybe, maybe not, and the dark green means, yeah, there's a pretty good chance that the student is going to be admitted to those colleges. All right, we're coming to the end. I'm almost done. Thank you for bearing with me. But I want to talk a little bit about paying the net price before we finish up. And that's really important. That's a critical part of this whole decision-making process. So I want to show you a model of how to think about how you might pay the net price and the types of questions that I think are important to keep in mind. Now remember that when we're talking about the net price, scholarship aid is already included. Gift aid is already included. And getting outside scholarships is very rare. So think about that net price as what you're going to pay. If you get any scholarships on top of that, that's gravy, but don't plan on that as how you're going to pay that high cost of college. So it turns out that the net price is paid from income that's earned over time. What do I mean by that? Well, there are 3 sources of income. One of them is prior income that was earned in the past and saved. Another is current income, income that's earned by the students or the parents during the college years and is used to pay for college expenses. The final kind of income is future income, income that's earned after college and is used to repay the principal and interest for the loans that you might have taken out to pay for college. All right, so with that in mind, let's go back to that award letter we looked at the beginning of the evening. It turned out that the net price was $34,865, and let's decide if that net price is affordable. We've got to remember that the cost of a degree is going to be for 4 years, and there are a couple of important questions that we need to ask. One of them is, how much are costs going to increase over time? And another really important question is the financial aid automatically renewable and on what terms? Now, it turns out that merit aid is usually renewable as long as the student maintains a specific GPA in college. Need-based aid is typically renewable as long as the family's income and assets remain pretty consistent over time. You always want to make sure that you understand what the terms are for renewing aid. So if it's not clear on the award letter, be sure you contact that college and get the answer to what are the terms for renewing the financial aid. So for this example, we're going to assume that costs increase 2% a year, the aid is renewable and constant for 4 years, and that the student has $2,000 in savings and the parents have $25,000 in savings. So let's go ahead and pay for college and see if the outcome makes sense. So when you inflate this $35,000 net price by 2% a year, it turns out that the 4-year cost of a degree is $145,000. How are we going to pay for that? Well, I'm going to look to the student first. The student was awarded work study, $1,800 a year, and the student can take out federal student loans. If you're going to borrow for college, federal student loans are always the first place to look, but the amount that you can borrow is limited. The student can borrow a maximum of $5,500 in year 1, $6,500 in year 2, and then $7,500 each in years 3 and 4. So that's a total of $27,000 that the student can borrow for 4 years of college. After this, we're going to look at the student savings and use that next. Remember when we were talking about the EFC calculation, student assets are assessed more heavily than parent assets. So let's use those student assets first, and maybe there might be a little bit more eligibility for need-based aid in years 2, 3, and 4. Next, we're going to say that the student is going to get a summer job. If the student works 40 hours a week for $10 an hour for 10 weeks in the summer, he or she will earn $4,000. They'll pay taxes, they'll go to the Old Orchard a couple of times, but they should still be able to save $2,000 each summer that they can use for college costs. At this point, we've used up what the student can contribute. So let's start looking at the parents. And in this case, these parents are going to look at their budget and they're going to say, well, we think that we can budget $375 a month out of our ongoing income to pay for college. That turns out to be $4,500 a year. After this, we're going to use $19,000 out of the parent savings, and that fully pays for year 1 at this college. In year 2, we're going to use another $5,900 in savings, and that's going to exhaust the savings that are available to pay for college. At this point, the only remaining way to pay the balance of the college cost is additional borrowing. And any borrowing beyond federal student loans, I consider a parent responsibility. The reason is that either the parent is going to have to borrow in his or her own name, or they may be asked to co-sign a loan for the student. So anything beyond federal student loans, I think it's best to think of as a parent responsibility. In this case, if the parents borrow $15,000 in year 2, $21,000 in year 3, and $22,000 in year 4, they fully pay for college. So that's the good news. This college is fully paid for using prior income, current income, and future income. And at the end of college, the student has $27,000 in debt, and the parents have $58,000 in debt. We don't yet know if taking out this amount of debt is a good idea or not. So how do we answer that question? The first thing we have to do is figure out how much it's going to cost to repay the debt. So in other words, what do federal loans cost? Student loans typically, historically, have been about 4.5%. They're a little bit less than that now due to the pandemic, but I think they're going to return to that. So when I'm thinking about planning, I typically use a more typical rate. Parent loans carry about a 7% interest rate, and the standard repayment term is 10 years, beginning 6 months after college. So it turns out that for every $1,000 of student debt, 4.5% interest paid over 10 years, the student has to pay $125 per year. For every $1,000 of parent debt, the parents need to pay $140 per year for 10 years. We said that the student has $27,000 in debt. 27 times 125 is $3,363. So that student needs to pay a little under $3,400 a year for 10 years in order to pay off that student loan. The parents, 58 times 140 is $8,100 a year. So to pay off the $58,000, the parents are going to have to pay $8,100 a year for 10 years after college. So is that amount of debt reasonable? Well, my rule of thumb for debt is that payments for education debt should not exceed about 10% of gross income. So let's look at that debt again. We said that for the student to repay $27,000 of debt, the student's going to be paying about $3,400 a year. If the student gets a job paying $34,000 a year, then they're going to have 90% of that $34,000 for taxes, rent, groceries, etc. And the good news is that a new college graduate on average makes about $40,000 a year. So I think that for a student, taking on $27,000 in student loans is not unreasonable. That's probably a manageable amount to take on for college. For parents, it's a more complicated story because they've got to consider their other obligations. They've got to think about college for their other children, and they've got to think about their retirement. And in this example, I see a huge red flag. Remember when we were talking about the parents, we said that they could budget $375 a month or $4,500 a year. Well, what makes these parents think that if they can only afford $4,500 a year during college, that all of a sudden after college, they can afford $8,100 a year? That to me is a big problem. And in this case, my conclusion would be this college is not affordable at this price, given the resources that the family has. So this affordability question is going to be different for every family, but the bottom line is kind of the same conceptually. Every family can choose a zone of affordability. And what that is a price that's affordable for the family. So if you identify that maximum price that's affordable for the family, all of the colleges whose four-year cost is less than that will also be affordable. My suggestion for a default zone of affordability is to identify the point where the parents can finish up college with no parent debt. To me, that's kind of the default zone of affordability for most parents. The student might have a manageable amount of debt. The parents may decide that they're willing to take on some debt. But if you identify the parent debt-free point, then I think that that's a pretty good way of thinking about that zone of affordability. So how might you do that? Well, what I suggest is making a table with two columns, one for the student and one for the parents, and then make three rows for prior income, current income, and future income. And for the student is going to be able to get work study in the summer job. So that's $16,000 in current income from the student. The student is also going to be able to get $27,000 in federal student loans. So that's a total of $43,000. If you identify any savings that the parent or students have, and you identify how much the parents can pay out of income for college expenses, then that represents the parent debt-free point. Don't include any parent borrowing. Add up all five of those other numbers, and that's your parent debt-free point zone of affordability. So a lot of people ask me, how does everyone else pay? And the answer is exactly the way that I've been describing to you tonight. The student can come up with $43,000 on his or her own, And if you want to pay for a college that costs more than that, then you've got to find either a college with a lower net price, or you need to find additional resources, either in the form of savings, income that the parents can borrow, can budget out of their ongoing earnings, or additional debt on the part of the parents. So we're almost done. I just want to have a few more words with you. And one of them is kind of a sense of perspective. As I mentioned, college questions can often be kind of emotional. It's your baby that you're thinking about. And a lot of people go through the stages of grief. It's a good idea to go through that process early, get it out of the way, and then focus on affordability. And it's also a good idea to make sure that your student knows that if there are constraints on how much can be paid for college, that you let them know while they're building their college list. Don't wait until spring of senior year to say, hey, we can't afford that. Another thing, college is important, but it's not the goal. The goal is to set the student up for success after college in a way that neither the student nor the parents are burdened by an excessive amount of debt. And if you think about your own life experience, I think that what you're going to realize is that when people get hired for jobs, where you went to college really makes very little difference. What employers care about is what you've done at your prior jobs, and they think that that's going to help them understand what they're going to be able to do for this employer. Another kind of perspective item is to think about some pretty successful people. Howard Schultz, who founded Starbucks, went to Northern Michigan University. Bob Iger, the longtime CEO of Walt Disney, went to Ithaca College. And the CEO of Hershey Foods went to Shippensburg University in Pennsylvania. What do they have in common? Those are all lesser known colleges. They're not the marquee elite colleges, but those folks did pretty well for themselves. And the final thing is to think about earnings potential. So even if you go to an expensive college, that may not translate into higher earnings potential. So it turns out that at Colby, American University in Clark, the difference in earnings for people in the middle of their careers at age 40 to 45 is only about $2,000 a year. But the difference between the high and the low net price at these four colleges is about $80,000. So as you're thinking about affordability, what you want to do is identify financial safeties. And there are two ways to do it. One is to use the techniques that I've described to you tonight. Use the numbers to identify colleges, identify your student's profile, and then identify colleges that are likely to award aid given your student's profile. Another kind of easier way to do it is to seed your list. And by that I mean include on the student's list colleges that have a wide variety of approaches to the way they award aid. Always include a public in-state college, University of Maine or USM or Farmington. Maybe you include some out-of-state public flagships or some secondary out-of-state schools like Keene State or Worcester State. If your student has high need, highly selective private colleges are probably going to meet a substantial portion of that need. Less selective colleges might have some good need-based aid and some merit. If you're looking for merit aid, consider looking at a group of colleges called the Colleges That Change Lives. And here's the website for them. These are great lesser known colleges. And for the most part, most of them award quite a bit of merit aid. And commuting and going to college is always an affordable choice. I want to remind you that the state of Maine has a special benefit for Maine residents. And if you deposit $1,000 a year into a state of Maine 529 account, the state will give you $300 a year for free. So even if your student is currently in high school, you might be able to get $1,500 or a couple of $1,000s of free money by contributing to a 529 plan. In addition, you'll be saving some of your own money, so you'll end up with several $1,000s that you can use for college. And the final thing I want to talk about is college in the time of COVID. So if your income has been affected by the pandemic, be sure to let colleges know. When you're filling out the FAFSA and the profile, fill in information for the year that the colleges are asking about. But if the aid forms don't really reflect your ability to pay, ask the college to consider special circumstances and see if they might award a little bit more. One thing that we are seeing as a result, I think, of the pandemic is that colleges are using early decision more. Early decision is an admissions, a way of applying to college in which the student says, if you admit me to your college and you award me enough financial aid to pay for it, in my opinion, I guarantee I will come. Colleges are using early decision more as a way of locking in their classes. Early decision is often an advantage for admission purposes. It's often a disadvantage for aid, though, because you won't have the ability to compare financial aid offers. So be careful if you consider early decision. Perhaps a silver lining of the pandemic is that many colleges are test optional, even for merit aid. And some people have worried that they might reduce the amount of discounts that they're offering. But it turns out that they're continuing to offer significant discounts. The very wealthy colleges still have enough for need-based aid, and the colleges that need to compete for students are continuing to discount their prices with merit aid in order to compete for students. And then, not specifically related to COVID, but applicable in any circumstance, is it always makes sense to ask for more aid if you're not pleased with the amount of aid a college has awarded. There's no guarantee that they're going to give you more, but the worst they can say is no. So with that, we're just about done. I have a website and I've got links to resources for financial aid type questions. And as I mentioned, I'll be happy to email a copy of the slides to anyone. If you just send me an email message, I'll email the slides to you tomorrow or later in the week. So with that, I appreciate everyone listening.